Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Nazarino. I'm presidential postdoc here at Brown University. And welcome to our first FEAST event. FEAST stands for the Forum for Entrepreneurship, Analytics, Scholarship, and Thought. One of the founders, Mark Suchman, professor of sociology, is here today joining us. Here at Brown, we are committed to rigorous and critical intellectual inquiry, and the goal of FEAST is to offer a form of the advancement of the study of entrepreneurship through a wide range of disciplinary and interdisciplinary lenses. So I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today's event. Banu Aksanank Pan is a visiting associate professor of sociology here at Brown, and she is the associate professor of management and entrepreneurship fellow at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She examines diversity and inclusion in organizations and entrepreneurship, and she is a recipient of the 2016 grant from the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation for her research examining the challenges and opportunities women entrepreneurs face in the St. Louis and Boston entrepreneurial ecosystems. Professor Aksanank Pan is currently working with the City of Boston's Women Entrepreneurs Boston Initiative, tech startups, and entrepreneur support organizations to overcome barriers to inclusion. Paolo Giordano is the executive director of the Center for the Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion at the City College of New York. Building upon more than 25 years of interdisciplinary research, teaching, entrepreneurship, consulting, public speaking, and writing, he recently embarked on a mission to use everything he has learned to revolutionize the way people think about diversity and inclusion and what we can do about it. This year, Paolo created the Initiative for the Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion, also known as QSDI, at the City College of New York, and launched the diversity tech company Alaria, where they quantify the link between diversity inclusion and performance, while Alaria provides a cloud-based platform to plan, execute, and measure the impact of diversity inclusion initiatives. Together, QSDI and Alaria will revolutionize diversity inclusion, much as digital media and programmatic advertising revolutionized advertising. Without further ado, let's welcome our speakers today.
So thank you so much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be presenting this work with Paolo. What I'll do today is to go over some of the things that I've been working on that led us to this combined collaboration and eventual project that came about. So our game plan. Jen gave you the overview. What I'm going to do is to talk about some of the things that we've discovered going through specifically the St. Louis and Boston research. And that research really came about, colleagues of mine and I applied for funding from the Kauffman Foundation, and you may all be aware that there's a lot of research and media press that's focused on diversity and inclusion, particularly in the space of entrepreneurship. So we were really interested in these issues as well, and we chose to focus on St. Louis and Boston. And very broadly, what we discovered was a little bit of a paradox. Here we were looking at Boston, which was this really established sort of liberal progressive ecosystem and city, but what we were seeing was that women were really laggards in terms of the number of business ownership. They really weren't growing at tremendous rates. In contrast, St. Louis, which is sort of an emergent and newly developing ecosystem, had somehow managed to go from having women-owned business to from being 28% to 44% in about 5 years. And we were really interested in understanding how could this be. So what I'm going to go through is to talk about, well, what are some of the reasons that we can talk about that may have led to these differential outcomes for women in these two different ecosystems, and then sort of talk about how that project helped us think about focusing very specifically on the VC space within ecosystems beyond any other sort of investor or entrepreneur support organization. So if you're familiar with gender and entrepreneurship, it's a well-documented area. It's a phenomenon. Hopefully I don't have to convince you that there is a gender gap in entrepreneurship. It is readily sort of seen in the media today, as well as through documented through many different research efforts of scholars over at least the last 3 decades. So some of the ways in which this research has taken shape is to look at the ways in which women might have different differential access to networks and funding opportunities, how there might be potential gender bias in assessing the competencies of women broadly as they are interacting with investors, and then more broadly in the sociocultural norms affecting women in terms of expectations around behavior, motherhood, domestic responsibilities, and simply the way we organize society as it relates to women. So what we adopt is a gender aware lens for understanding how society is organized, and within that realm, how do women experience these different ways in which we try to embark on entrepreneurship. So while entrepreneurship is a broad field, we are specifically focused on ecosystems. So ecosystems has been a new and coming sort of concept to think about how to organize our understanding of entrepreneurship. If you're familiar, clusters used to be the way we thought about it, but clusters was quite narrow, and it used to really be focused on specific industries. Ecosystem allows us to think about more dynamic ways in which people engage in these exchange relationships and interact in the space of cities, regions, and how various different support organizations, either directly or indirectly, support entrepreneurship activities. So ESOs, as we call them, play a pretty significant intermediary role in acting as potentially gatekeepers or sort of opening doors for others in terms of having access to resources and networks and just the vast wealth of a resource, of an ecosystem. So while we adopt a gender-aware approach, which sort of puts gender as sort of our starting point for looking at these issues, much of the research that looks at ecosystems assumes a gender-neutral or gender-blind perspective, which means that many of the economic development policies that are developed without a sense of what are the gendered outcomes that might come about. So how might the impact of particular policies impact men and women differently? This is something that's just starting to gain some steam in some of the development agencies around the world, as we recognize that the way we experience the world does make a difference, whether or not you're a man or a woman. So one of the things we were interested in looking at is if there are ESOs, entrepreneur support organizations, that are interested in changing this gender gap, what are those things that they're doing? So the way we try to understand this is to use institutional theory. And institutional theory is helpful because it can help us understand whether or not ESOs are engaging in social action in the form of gender inclusion activities. What are they doing if they are? So if you're familiar with institutional theory broadly, it's a way to understand how the different institutional environments that we are in sort of lead to different ways in which organizations behave in them. So the organizational action component is really important. So some examples of some voluntary organizational action that are taken up, particularly in terms of remedying social ills, are CSR initiatives, so voluntary corporate codes of conduct, particularly in the context of outsourcing or offshoring, or becoming signatories to various environmental compacts. So these are different organizational actions that are being taken up to remedy some of these social issues and environmental issues. We specifically draw from the work of Markey, Glenn, and Davis, who suggest that both the nature and the level of corporate social action arises from the different institutional pressures that are present and specific to the local communities in which they're embedded. So depending on which community an organization is embedded in, the kinds of actions they take might be different from a differently placed organization that is also trying to do something similar. So there are three sources that that sort of lead to these pressures arising, and one are these cultural cognitive sort of dimension, which is essentially saying there are shared frameworks for understanding the social world. Second are social normative, which is essentially saying there are these accepted norms and standards for appropriate behaviors. So if an organization is doing X, it's more likely that another organization within the vicinity will try to copy that. And then lastly, there are regulatory forces at play that sort of either prevent, inhibit, or promote particular ways of acting that are specific to local communities. So we use this framework to look at ESOs, particularly in terms of gender inclusion activities. And we chose St. Louis and Boston for two reasons. One, St. Louis is up and coming, and we wanted to know how such an up and coming ecosystem was able to go from having such few women-owned businesses to so many over such a short amount of time. And two, Boston is established. We had a sense that changing something that's established is probably going to be more difficult. So what are those things that are happening in Boston that could potentially lead to significant changes? So over the course of 3 years, we did significant number of interviews, observations, and we ended up with a total of 190 interviews. And here you can see the breakdown. We looked at 14 ESOs in St. Louis and 37 female and 57 male entrepreneurs. In Boston, we had a lot more ESOs to choose from, so we had almost 30, and we had 29 female and 27 male entrepreneurs so far. And we've continued sort of speaking to further numbers of entrepreneurs since we finished this study. And just graphically, you can see St. Louis from 2007 to 2008, right here, it went up. So it used to be right around 28%, and then it shot up to 44% in 5 years. Boston was around 30%, right around here, 29.5 actually. Then it went to 33, so very slow growth. And this year, actually, the mayor's office released numbers that say women-owned businesses account for only 35% of all businesses in Boston. I'm still waiting on SBO data from last year to calculate that out for St. Louis. So how do we explain these differences? One of the ways we try to explain it is to use the framework I just discussed in institutional theory and to say, is there a way in which we can understand what's happening? So very broadly, St. Louis is it's very recent in terms of an ecosystem. If you're familiar with the Cambridge Innovation Center, it set up shop in St. Louis a couple of years ago. There's now transnational connection. There's actually Indian and Israeli entrepreneurs who are coming into St. Louis, very much mimicking some of the things we've seen in Silicon Valley. And they like to call themselves the middle is the new edge, right? So they have a very different frame of who they are and how they're trying to occupy a space, given that Silicon Valley and Boston tend to dominate most conversations on startups and entrepreneurship. We found that there's a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs to connect, to learn, to engage with each other in St. Louis, and this is based on our interviews and observations over the course of 3 years. In many ways, male and female entrepreneurs express similar rates in their intentions to grow businesses, and this is key because a lot of times the assumption is women just don't want to grow their businesses, and what we're saying is that's really not true. They are interested in growing their businesses. What has happened in St. Louis, though, despite sort of the growth, there's still somewhat of a separation, which was until recently much more pronounced. So women were in many ways having a parallel ecosystem and were kind of sidelined from the main ecosystem where they weren't accessing as many of the resources or networks as the existing one. And what we noticed, I think, that is probably the biggest, aha moment for us was that these inclusion efforts are driven by grassroots, intentions and actions. So entrepreneurship policy at the level of government or city is actually really thin, if it exists at all. And many of the efforts are driven by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs in St. Louis. It's kind of a go-get-'em attitude. We find that in St. Louis, women tend to, as they do in many other ecosystems, rely on these pre-existing connections, so friends and family for resources compared to males. So that's nothing different. And they do report having encountered an old boys club with its cultures and attitudes. And what they've noticed is that this kind of translates into implicit and explicit bias in terms of the abilities and competencies of women. Men also, interestingly, notice that there's an old boys club, but they realize that even if their age doesn't merit sort of belonging to the old boys club because they're younger, they still benefit from it because they can still be part of any of the informal outings, such as hunting, going to bars, and sort of these informal activities that allow for these business connections to flourish. So even if they are aware of it and they're not necessarily agreeing with it, they're still benefiting from it. And overall, men and women describe that they are aware there's homophily across gender, race, and education. So people of the same or gender or race or educational background tend to have networks of similar folks in St. Louis. What has happened in St. Louis is that the entrepreneur support organizations have become incredibly effective in communicating their offerings, their programs, their intention to reach extra and underserved communities by using appropriate media outlets. That means that they're not simply sending out email blasts, they're actually going to gas stations, community centers, using languages other than English, using media that's appropriate, for example, Spanish channels, Spanish-speaking channels, to reach out to communities that would benefit from these resources but are often distanced from them for various reasons, including language, geography, and lack of knowledge or information. So these inclusion efforts became quite mainstream quite quickly, because in the beginning of St. Louis, in terms of sort of the rise of the ecosystem, it was predominantly men who decided that they really wanted to do something different after the manufacturing base had sort of disintegrated. How do we revive St. Louis? And it was truly a number of prominent businessmen, entrepreneurial men who got together, but soon women were asked to come to the table too. So from the beginning, St. Louis had a very different makeup of who was driving some of these entrepreneur support organizations and efforts, and from the beginning, women were part of the conversation, as there was a shared understanding that the gender gap is a problem that people want to address. Lastly, there are also women-focused support organizations in St. Louis, so they tend to take only women cohorts, and what we've seen is over time, they've become mainstream, so they partnered with sort of these broader or bigger entrepreneur support organizations, so they're feeding them cohorts and applicants. So there's a nice synergy there. In contrast, Boston was a bit of a conundrum. You know, it tends to be incredibly liberal and progressive, at least conceptually when we think of Boston. It's a hotbed of education. There's a lot of universities. There's a lot of niche industries that are known: biotech, healthcare, nonprofit industry, Internet of Things, AI, virtual reality. So all these sort of cutting edge technologies we tend to associate, for the most part, definitely with Boston. But we were seeing that these great innovations were not necessarily as inclusive in terms of women. And it becomes even more distressing when you parse out gender by race in education. So then you see that women of color tend to be the most segregated, most marginalized from the ecosystem, particularly in Boston. So while it is a resource, incredibly resource-rich context, and there are many opportunities to connect, learn, to engage with between entrepreneurs, we still are finding these discrepancies in who's accessing which networks and which resources. So similar to St. Louis, women are also expressing an interest to grow their businesses, so that's not the explanation for why they're not getting funding necessarily. In Boston, I can literally tell you in one hand the number of high growth women entrepreneurs. There's about 5 or 6 of them. And in interviewing them, one of the most common things that they have said is, I chose not to start a family, I chose not to have children. Which is a really difficult thing to hear, because you realize that there's actual material consequences to the way we've structured how entrepreneurship gets done, particularly in Boston. There is a lot of conversation around diversity, so it's not to say that people are not talking about it. They're definitely talking about it, but that's what we found, is they're talking about it. They're not really doing anything about it. And interestingly, we have some of the most progressive state and city level policies around gender equity. For example, Massachusetts is leading the way in terms of policies that prevent employers from asking for salary history. That tends to be an unfair advantage for women, and the city of Boston often holds salary negotiation workshops for free. So there's a lot of things that are happening at the city level and the state level in terms of trying to bring in more policy initiatives to help equate the playing field. Interestingly, in Boston, women are a little bit more indebted than males, and they very, very vocally say they just simply don't know who to connect to, and they face bias in terms of how their competencies are assessed, particularly when they start pitching to VCs. And I'll sort of connect that back to how Paulo and I became interested in the VC space specifically. And similar to St. Louis, there's homophily. So gender, race, and education, again, play a very dominant role in who connects to whom and who doesn't. In a big difference from St. Louis, the entrepreneur support organizations in Boston are really, truly ineffective in communicating the amount of programs and opportunities available to people who would benefit but are simply not on the emails. And email is not a communication method that's appropriate for them. So what we end up seeing at these sort of meetings or informal events or even formal events is you see similar types of people congregating and coming together week after week. And that's sort of based on our observations week after week of who's coming to these events, who's talking to who, and who's leaving with a couple of cards in their hands or connections. In Boston, you may be aware, but the Brookings Institute ranks Boston as the #1 city for income inequality. And if you've been in Boston, you realize there are segregated neighborhoods, literally, that are segregated by the river or by mass transit. So there's different ways in which segregation happens, and we're interested in understanding how it happens in the space of entrepreneurship. So lastly, what I want to say was, well, how do we explain overall these different things that are happening? And what we use is the 3 different sort of frameworks that come to us from institutional theory. And in the cultural cognitive, which is how we make sense of the world, we say that in Boston, there's really a lack of cohesion or community identity on the issue of the gender gap. And in many of our interviews, we find people saying, well, Boston's a meritocracy. What we do is based on gender neutrality, and if gender neutrality means we're getting the best, why would we want to change that? And so what we're sort of struggling with is how to frame the conversation in a way that debunks the idea that there is a meritocracy and that the outcomes that replicate particular people getting funded over and over warrant some examination. Second, the socio-normative, or what are the norms for behavior? What are the norms that organizations follow? We find that ESOs predominantly tend to follow each other and copy each other. So if one has a women-focused event or panel, a second and third one will follow suit, and we'll have like these pop-up events within a week of like 6 women-focused parallel tracks and events, and then it disappears, right? So the way to do gender in Boston is essentially to say, let's have a women-focused event here and there, but it doesn't change the overall dynamic or the overall sort of ways in which the organization behaves. It doesn't change the leadership of these organizations, which tend to be predominantly male, and it doesn't change the ways in which they go about selecting, recruiting, and funding their cohorts. So there's a lot of discussion and awareness of the issue, but very little action. And then lastly, in terms of the regulatory, so any government or industry-based regulations, this is becoming an interesting space because in Boston, we do have these state and city level policies, but we're not sure that they're making a big difference in terms of changing the dynamic on the ground. So what we're seeing in St. Louis is these grassroots-driven efforts where men and women, entrepreneurs alike, and others sort of are working together, have a shared understanding of the gender gap as a problem, and are working collectively to address it. So there is some cohesion and collective collaboration. Whereas in Boston, you find women-focused groups, women-focused events, and women-focused conferences that are, for the most part, just running in parallel to the broader ones that are being run that tend to attract more younger males. So overall, we see these distinct ways in which people behave in these different ecosystems, and potentially that's one way to think about why women continue to be marginalized in one ecosystem much more than they do in the other. So altogether, that research was incredibly informative for me to think about, well, within this space, what are some influential ways or interventions, levers of intervention that we could focus on, and the VC space. The VCs became quite important, trying to understand why they might be a lever for change. And the project that Paulo and I have embarked upon is really trying to understand the role and impact of VCs on how this transfer of resources happens in ecosystems. So how are they responsible, and how might their decisions and actions impact who gets funding, what kind of funding, and who eventually does not get funding. So we know from research that there's a growing number of cities and regions in the U.S. that are trying to build and develop their economies by building these entrepreneurial ecosystems. And within that, as I mentioned, ESOs are incredibly important. But what we're going to do is to focus on the VC space. So these are some stats and numbers. We know that women-owned businesses are overall only 11% of all employer firms in the U.S. And in fact, if you look from 2007 to 12, overall in the U.S., it actually went down. And the biggest decline was for African American and Hispanic women. We do know that the potential is great. So if women own businesses, if there were more of them, for example, you'd have these really amazing things where it would have the 5th largest GDP in the world, right? If we were to count all the women-owned businesses as their own country. So they have a huge economic impact, and that could be even more. And there's some data that suggests that if there's economic parity, that each state and city can add at least 5% to their GDP if we achieve economic parity between men and women. So what are some positive ways in which we can talk about it? And oftentimes it is the financial route. Like we say, well, why do we want to make sure that we invest in women? Well, here's sort of the economic case for that, beyond sort of the social equity and justice case, which sometimes doesn't get you as far. So we recognize that. And so these are sort of other ways in which we can talk about why we should care about women-owned businesses and what is happening in the space of investment. And here we get into the VC space. So about 85% of all VC-funded businesses have no women on their executive team. Only 2.7% of VC-funded companies have a woman CEO, which is to say 93% of them don't. Right? So these are pretty stark and horrific numbers in our view. And we're trying to understand, well, how did these numbers happen? And what we're going to try to explain to you is some of the ways in which we're trying to understand this using qualitative, my approach, and quantitative, which is Paulo's approach, to understand how these numbers come about. So within this context, the project that we're embarking upon with the support of the Kauffman Foundation is to understand the impact of which resources exist in an entrepreneurial ecosystem and how they're transferred to who needs them. But we're focusing specifically on VCs. And while they only fund less than 1% of all startups, they actually control a significant proportion of startup funding. And if you can imagine, they occupy sort of a special and privileged position in our social imaginary in terms of who and what VCs are and what they do. So what we propose is to combine our expertise in terms of qualitative approaches that really have a sort of a pulse on how these things happen on the ground through ethnographies and field work, and simulations that can hopefully mimic and understand human-centric behavior based on the data that we provide for it. Why are we doing this? Well, one, we really care about diversity and inclusion, but two, there's also these research gaps that exist in the literature, which is we really don't know much about the social structure of the networks of VC firms, right? Who do VCs talk to? How do they talk to them? How do they connect to them? And how does that potentially impact who they fund and don't fund? And geography. How does geography make a difference in funding and racial segregation? There's some research on this, but we want to expand further on this to understand what happens when particular types of innovation diffuse into neighborhoods and cities. Does that help equality, or does that actually lead to potentially further inequalities? And we have some ideas about that. And thirdly, we want to get information on those unseen startups, those people who applied for VC funding but were turned away. What happens to them? Why are they not funded? Where do they go? And what happens? And are they of a particular kind of people or our firm? And then lastly, by combining sort of qualitative and quantitative approaches, we feel that this is a much more robust way to understand how ecosystems work, and then potentially to find ways in which we can intervene to make some of those changes. So I'm going to pass it over to Paulo to maybe give you a little bit oversight about himself and the way in which our agent simulation is going to work. So,
thank you.
Thank you, Paulo.
So I want to thank you, first of all, I want to thank you, Banu, both for inviting me to come here to this presentation, but also because of the fact that she reached out to me a few months ago when we barely knew each other and said, hey, there's this great RFP from the Kauffman Foundation. Do you want to team up on it? And we did, and here we are. We've been selected for an award and very excited about it. Now, the work that Banu already presented is something that she did previously, in fact, before I even knew her. And so we have not yet done, in fact, we've not even finalized the paperwork with Kaufman, so we don't have any results that we can report. But what I thought might be interesting would be to show you a bit about the kinds of work that I've done in the past and why we think that there's such an exciting opportunity to leverage both the qualitative work that you've heard about, as well as some of the quantitative work that I've been doing for almost 30 years now. So in order to do that, I just want to set the stage a little bit about what exactly it is that we were trying to address from the Kaufman Foundation. Their program to which we responded, the RFP to which we responded, was called the Uncommon Methods and Metrics. And their idea was that they wanted to find better methodologies and metrics to measure the state of affairs in the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the United States. And what we proposed, and their concern was that a lot of the data are showing a decline in entrepreneurship, but they're finding that the kind of data they're collecting is not sufficient to really help you understand what is going on. So they thought, can we find both new kinds of data to collect? For example, let's talk to VCs and find out about the unseen companies, or can we find some new methodologies to collect the data? And we proposed something. We said, look, it's not enough really to just look at the data, because if you do that, you end up going on a fishing trip and you don't know where you're going to come up with. And maybe the data that you collect may give you actually more questions than answers. And so instead, what we did is we proposed to do a collaboration in which we actually collaborated on selecting the kind of data that we would collect out in the field, and use it also to develop a simulation of a particular kind that's called agent-based, and that's what I'm going to tell you about for the next several slides. And using that approach, we're going to develop two kinds of models. First, a model of how venture capital firms work, and in particular, how their social networks and the rules that they use to select entrepreneurs for funding influence the flow of resources into the entrepreneurial community. And then secondly, as Banu hinted at the end of her part of the presentation, we're also interested in understanding how the socio-economic fabric in which these operators are giving funding influence the flow of resources. So the same VC operating in St. Louis is going to have very different impact than the same VC operating in Boston. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend, so the next several slides have nothing to do with the project, but they tell you about the underpinnings of the kind of methodology that we're going to be using to build these simulations. And at the heart of that is a scientific approach known as complexity science, which is something that has been around for more than 30 years now. It started out in the field of sociology, and it has to do with understanding the interaction between individuals and systems as a whole. So what do I mean by complexity? A system is complex, and again, you can find lots of definitions, but in terms of a scientific discipline that defines complexity, we typically think of two things. A system is complex if it has a lot of elements, like entrepreneurs, investors, banks, people, and so on and so forth. And these elements interact with each other, and the behavior of the system as a whole emerges from these interactions. As a case in point, when you hear data such as the ones that we heard about before, that only 2.7% of all VC-backed companies have female CEOs, that is an example of an emergent behavior, right? There isn't somebody that says, oh, we're going to make it 2.7%. It's the result of all of these factors that ultimately lead to that emergent outcome. Now, what is interesting about it is that in many cases, if a system exhibits emergent behaviors, often it's really, really difficult to predict what is going to happen, even if you know what all the elements are doing. And that is one of the hallmarks of complex systems. And one thing that I always want to point out, people often think of emergent as meaning catastrophic. Oh, like something blew up. Something, the 2008 market crashes. Sometimes they're catastrophic, but even something much more simple can be considered an emergent behavior. And I love to give some examples from Mother Nature. Geese flying in formation. They don't have a pilot with a helmet speaking to the geese saying, hey, you go 35 degrees to the left or 35 degrees to the right. How about fish, right? Here's a beautiful picture of a school of fish moving away as a shark is moving through. They don't use Slack. They don't use Twitter, right? How the hell do they do this? How do they do it? This is what we're really interested in. Now, lest you think that complexity is only a thing about natural phenomena, there are a lot of systems with which we deal daily that exhibit the same kinds of complexity. For example, stock markets, right? Everybody is doing something very discrete. They all know what they're doing. They're trying to make money. And yet, the result is incredible fluctuations that, for all intents and purposes, look random. What about sports teams? I happen to spend 25 years in Boston, so I'm still sort of, love the Red Sox, even though I live in New York now. And how do you explain a baseball team winning or a baseball team losing? What about something like traffic? This is something we're all familiar with. In fact, one of the things that I love about traffic, to give you an idea of the disconnection between the individual behavior and the system behavior, we all sit in traffic jams. And I guarantee you that there's nobody that gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to cause a traffic jam. Every one of those people is trying to do exactly the same thing. They're trying to get to work or home or to school as quickly as possible. but the emergent behavior is something completely unpredictable from the behaviors of the individuals. It turns out that some human systems are what I would describe as complicated, not complex. And what do I mean by that? Well, a complicated system also has a lot of parts, but then you know what every part is doing. Examples of that abound, right? An airplane. Somebody once described the Boeing as 1 million parts flying in close formation. So there's a lot of parts that interact with each other, but if something is not working, hopefully when you're on the ground, and so hopefully nothing too major, you can plug in something and it tells you, oh, this part is broken, you pull it out and you fix it. Same thing with cars. Same thing with computers. And one of the fundamental differences between complex systems and complicated systems is this notion of these emergent behaviors. There is a striking comparison that I love to use in some of my presentations, which has to do with cathedrals. So the first kind of cathedral, which happens in nature, excuse me, is a cathedral nest. These are nests that are built by termites. They're found primarily in Africa, and these are incredible structures that can be several meters high. And what's fascinating about them is that they have these incredibly complex sets of chambers and chimneys, and every one of them is different. And yet, they're designed so that even though the temperature outside can vary by as much as 100 degrees between day and nighttime, the queen's chamber stays within 1 degree all the time. Again, you don't see a chief engineer termite going around telling everybody else what to do. Very simple rules lead to these emergent structures. Contrast that with St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. I was in a meeting one day about 4 years ago. They were doing all this construction, and they looked like termites. It was people running around on the scaffolding. And I can assure you that if there was a flood or if there was a gigantic anteater that went and started to destroy it, it would probably take years and years and years to get the project back on budget. Whereas the termites, they just bounce right back and rebuild it or do something different. Now, one of the things that I want to do to bring your attention to the increased complexity of some of these issues is that a system does not necessarily need to be complicated in order to be complex. So I'm going to show you an example of a really, really simple system, something that looks ridiculously simple, which nonetheless exhibits these emergent behaviors. Suppose you're at a party and there's a bunch of people. The fact that this is like 4 quadruplets, it's coincidence, right? So here you are at a party and you're going to play a game. And if we have time at the end, maybe we can do this, but it works all the time. So you play a game with 2 different rules. The first rule, you say, okay, here's me, and I'm going to choose 2 people randomly. One is going to be the aggressor and one is going to be the defender. So here's the aggressor, here's the defender. And when I say go, your goal is to move in such a way that the defender is preventing you from being seen by the aggressor. So this is somebody that you don't like, and this is somebody protecting you. So you're going to move down there. Now what you do is you play the same, and you do that, and you find that people mill around, and you get these galaxies, and people kind of walk around in various ways. And now you change the rules ever so slightly. You say, okay, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm still going to find an aggressor and a defender, but now in this case, I'm the defender. So here is the aggressor, okay, and here's the person that I'm defending. Okay, this is, his ex-wife is here, and he doesn't want to see her, whatever the case might be. So when I say go, you move in the middle. Turns out that when you do that, whereas in the first case, and this is just a little simulation, in the first case, you see scattering. In the second case, instantly, the whole room collapses into a ball. And I've done this with 6-year-old Cub Scouts, and I've done it with rooms full of CEOs. So this has nothing to do with the cognitive processes. It's something about these emergent behaviors. Now, the reason why I like this is because I consider it a deceptively simple complex system. Why? Well, even though we know the behavior of every individual, it's very difficult to predict what the outcome is going to be. And to me, the other thing that should be really scary to most people that worry about systems is that all we did is we made a tiny little change in the rules and we got completely different system level behaviors. If you're running a company, the kind of reductionist approach that people use of divide and conquer simply does not work. You can't do it that way. So how do we control emergence? How do we actually define the individual behaviors so that we get the desired emergent patterns? Or in the case of the project that we're doing, how do we understand how the behaviors of the individual lead to the emergent patterns that we see in the entrepreneurial ecosystem? And unfortunately, too often, people take an approach where they say, oh, we can just write boxes and say, hey, look, here's where the problem is, right? Let's go fix it here. And we all know that that does not work very typically, and you can get some unexpected outcomes. So the reductionist approach to problem solving, which is analyze the behavior of the system by analyzing each part in isolation, and then fixing a problem by fixing the individual parts, simply does not work when you're talking about a complex system like an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And unfortunately, most management tools and analytical tools that are available to us only really work for simple systems, And what you need is a different approach here. That approach is what we are using to understand questions such as, can you just replace a player when the team is not performing very well? Or is there a single reason to explain the collapse of the markets, the financial collapse in 2008? Or can we I'm Italian, so I can make a joke about this, right? But can we remove Italian drivers to stop traffic jams? So the methodology that I'm going to show you fairly briefly and then show you how we can apply it to some of these relevant issues is this idea of agent-based simulation. In a nutshell, what you do is you change the viewpoint from a system level or top-down to the level of individual elements. In our case, we're interested in people. And then each of the people or each of these agents follows rules. For example, moving around the room and following people around. And the behavior of the system as a whole depends on the interactions with the other agents and with the environment, so that the overall system behavior is often very difficult to predict. And let me give you a very simple example. We are all experts of traffic, right? So let's say that somebody comes to me and says, okay, we see too much traffic on Route 128 around Boston. We're thinking about adding a lane. Can you help us figure out what would be the best way to do that? The traditional way to approach that, using a statistical methodology, would be something like this. We're going to collect data from a current situation. We're going to identify correlations with some key variables. And then we're going to try to extrapolate to new conditions. So here's kind of a caricature of that. Let's say that I'm measuring how traffic is impacted by weather. Each circle is an observation. The line is some kind of a mathematical equation that represents my best model. And then a prediction would be going to a point that I've not seen yet and understanding what is the traffic likely to be. Agent-based simulation, completely different. We start out by asking, how do people drive? We all drive, right? It's not that difficult. You don't have equations in your head when you're driving. What do? Well, roughly speaking, if there's nobody in front of you, you accelerate. Some of us a little bit harder than others. Okay? If there's somebody in front of you, hopefully you slow down and you don't hit them. And then if there are lanes, you might change lanes sometimes. And it turns out that if you build a super simple simulation with just those rules in it, no math, just a simple little game that shows people accelerating and decelerating, you can actually get some amazingly accurate representations of the behavior of traffic. And I'm going to show you very quickly a video here. It's okay.
For the first time, Japanese researchers have conducted a real-life experiment that shows how some traffic jams appear for no apparent reason. They placed 22 vehicles on a single track and asked the drivers to cruise around at a constant speed of 30 kilometers an hour. At first, traffic moved smoothly, but soon the distance between cars started to vary and vehicles clumped together at one point on the track. So the jam spread backwards around the track like a shockwave at a rate of about 20 kilometers an hour. Real-life jams move backwards at about the same speed.
So shockwaves, great, little loop. Again, I don't know shockwave equations. I mean, I studied aerospace engineering, so I used to know shockwave equations, but I certainly don't think of that when I'm driving. Here's a model over here that was built with this tool called NetLogo. And it shows cars. It's actually a circular strip, but for simplicity, it's drawn as a line. But so cars go off the end over here and come back. What I'm going to show you is something that looks eerily like what you just saw in that experiment. So the cars are very, very simple behaviors. They accelerate. If they see a car in front of them, they decelerate. And then otherwise, they try to get to a comfortable cruising speed. And here's what it looks like. You will see that initially everything is flowing fine. And here we're just plotting the minimum, maximum, and speed of one particular car. And what you see is that all of a sudden, you start to get these traffic jams. And look at the traffic jam moving backwards. There's no math in this model. There's literally it's the simplest possible model that you could build. It's got super, super stupid assumptions in it. But one of the things that you find out is that, for example, it turns out that the rate of deceleration is the single most important factor. Why? I'm driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour. Somebody in front of me taps their brakes. What do? I hit my brakes. They're going 60. I'm now going 50. The car behind me is going 40. You do that 3 more cars and you got yourself a traffic jam. So if you could actually reduce the deceleration rate, then you could actually ease traffic in a very fundamental way. Now, that's a very cool example because everybody knows about traffic. Let's talk about something that is more related to what we are interested in. It turns out that one of the ways in which this model or this kind of modeling approach has been used is to understand segregation. I lived in Boston for 25 years. I know exactly how segregated it is, and it's a fairly significant phenomenon. But what's interesting is that you talk to people and they'll say, oh, I'm not a racist. I don't mind being around people that don't look like me. And what's interesting then is that segregation manifests itself frequently, even though people claim that they want to be integrated, and they still end up segregated. How could we possibly explain that? What are some ways that we might simulate that using a computer simulation or computer model to see if there are some ways of replicating segregation without necessarily building it into the model. So what we did is that we built, actually, I didn't do this. This is actually part of the public domain libraries here. We have a model in which there are agents of two kinds, red and green. And they have a certain desire to live with a certain numbers of similar neighbors around them. So you look at the immediate 8 cells around you, and you say, how many of them are the same as me and how many of them are different? And if you're not happy, let's say that you want to have 50% like you and 50% different. If you only have 40% like you, then you're going to look for a new empty spot and you're going to move. Very simple. Okay, so let me show you what that actually looks like. So here is my model of segregation. I'm going to try to make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, unfortunately, okay. That's okay. So here what I'm doing is there's going to be 2,000 people in this population. And when I click go, what's going to happen is that people are going to try to move around and find a satisfaction that meets that level. So here I have, I believe, 30% similar wanted. So in fact, so if I do that and I say go, what you'll see is that you already see some clusters, some red cluster and green clusters. And that's if you're happy with just 30% of the people like you. What happens if I make it 50%? So here is a population in which basically everybody individually says, I would be perfectly happy if half of the people were green and half of the people were red around me. And let's see what happens when we go. Look at that. Right? Just astounding, right? And why is that the case? Well, because if you think about it, if you're surrounded by people that look like you, you're not unhappy. You're perfectly fine. So you only get these weird boundary conditions. And those boundary conditions are basically what cause segregation. Or that's one way to explain how you can get this kind of emergent segregation. So I always love that model because I kind of feel like it's really shocking. And again, if you were to look inside the code, you would realize that it's actually, and boom, here we go. Oh, there we go. That's not what I meant to do, but it's okay. Because I'm gonna fast forward here, hopefully. So here we are. So, and even if you have things like, once you start to increase, like here in this case, I was 67%. So I would be happy with 1/3 of the people in my neighborhood looking differently from me. And this is what you get. So even when each agent wants 50% or less of its own kind in the vicinity, you quickly settle into segregated population. And then the last example that I want to give you, which is actually very, very close to one of the aspects that we're trying to simulate, and it has to do with economic disparity, and in a similar way to this model, but in a slightly more complex example, there is an example of how you can see emergent phenomena that represent economic disparity. This was actually motivated by something that Banu actually shared with me a few weeks ago. It was an article in which a study was done showing that innovation tends to lead to urban segregation by economy, and that it's particularly acute when companies going into regions are companies that are highly innovative. And a lot of that has to do apparently because of the fact that highly innovative companies are looking for talent. So they tend to go where real estate is more expensive, and they tend to hire people that tend to come from better backgrounds. And by doing that, they draw even more affluence to those areas at the cost of other areas. And so this is the article. I think we can leave a copy of the PowerPoint if anybody wants it. That's the URL of the article. Segregation, so what are the structural parameters? What are the pieces that we use to make up a model of this? There are different people with different economic means. They're in a particular geographical location. There's going to be housing, infrastructure, other kinds of urban assets. And the behavior that we're interested in is can we show segregation based on economic factors? And so here is the model. I'm going to actually just very quickly. So we built a little simulation that has land usage patterns. So you have a piece of land, and then you have two kinds of people. You have rich people and poor people. And you have businesses that want to move into that area depending on the population, and the population grows over time. And the rule is actually very simple. The rich people care about two things. They care either about the quality of the area or they care about the proximity to the services, whereas the poor people care about the proximity of the services, but also they care about the cost of living. So in other words, the rich don't really care about the cost of living, the poor do. And then the only assumption that is a little bit funny is the fact that we assume that very much like innovative companies, these services move into areas that are more affluent, where there tends to be higher property value. And the property value depends on who lives on it. So let me show you. I'm going to move again to the actual simulation. Now this one is a little bit hard to see, but basically what I'm going to show you is, so we're starting out with, it's hard to see, but there is a dot in the middle, and then there are some pink dots and blue dots. The dot in the middle is a service. The pink dots are rich people, and the blue dots are poor people. And what you see is that the color of the land is representative of the value of the land. So right now it's neutral. If it goes black, it means that it's less value. If it goes white or yellow, bright yellow, it means that it's more value. So let's see what happens when we take this and run it. And again, it makes very, very simple assumptions. So what you start to see is the emergence of a kind of urban environment where you get clustering of wealthy people in the center, and most of the businesses are going there. And then you get periphery that looks very poor. And most of the poor people live in the periphery. The value of the property goes down. And most of the businesses tend to locate themselves in the center. This, by the way, looks an awful lot like Boston. This is what you tend to get in a lot of the more modern cities. You can actually take these things and make different assumptions. Like in this case, we're assuming we have all these parameters here that allow us to figure out, for example, how much people care about price versus value, et cetera. And you can change the parameters and have situations in which you get the opposite, where you get poor inner cities and the rich suburbs. So to conclude, the goal of our project is to develop an agent-based simulation of VC firms, including their networks, the criteria that they use to select firms, and the companies that they fund and that they reject. And then we also want to develop an agent-based simulation, and the example that I showed you is already a beginning of that, in which you look at socioeconomic factors and the resources and the connections between entrepreneurs and how that influences the flow of resources. And then eventually we want to combine the two and show, ideally, a replication of the observed data, but also we're hoping that by manipulating the parameters, we can give recommendations to the VCs about how they can change their behaviors so as to create a better ecosystem for entrepreneurs. Why are we taking this dual approach? We think that the agent-based simulation is ideally suited to capture the complexities of this kind of problem, but the data collection is equally important because the models that I've shown you are great, but until you actually go in and you match the data to what you see in the real world, then you're basically just playing a theoretical exercise. And our hope is that our project is going to give deeper insights into entrepreneurship in the USA, and that it's going to help the VC firms to adjust their behaviors to level the playing field in entrepreneurship. That's it. Thank you. And now we're here for questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's 2 microphones on each side to walk up and ask a question to our panelists.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting talks. I'm aware of, and I'm sure you are as well, of venture firms that are focused on women entrepreneurs. Golden Seeds is one in New York. And I wonder if you have a position. Is that a good idea or is that a bad idea? Does it just encourage exclusionary treatment of one gender over another, or is it a correction that needs to happen to sort of, I guess, I don't know if this is what they're thinking, to seed the environment in a way to encourage women entrepreneurs forward?
So I'm familiar with Golden Seeds. I interviewed them actually as part of the research, and I'm familiar of how they do things. Couple of thoughts. One is they are sort of a response to an environment in which women were not getting funded, but they are also seed investors, so the amounts that they invest are quite minimal. And in fact, if you sort of parse out the whole investment scene, VCs are only one type. There's microloans. There's all kinds of sort of stages in which investment happens. And what we find is that even with those investments, they don't really support high growth women as much. Right, and I don't know how much you know about how Golden Seeds does their sort of due diligence and funding. It's actually quite competitive where compared to other models, which might bring in women, support them, and then fund them, they bring in women, train them, have them pitch, and then support them. So there's sort of a different model, which actually is a source of controversy, at least in Boston, around how they should be supporting women.
So I want to add something to that. The issue that you bring up related to investment, I think, has been discussed more broadly in the context of affirmative action in general.
Right.
And one of the simulations that I've personally built is a simulation that shows why you have to have affirmative action. And it's not enough just to say, so when people say, oh, now we're discriminating against guys that look like me, that's kind of a very short-sighted way to think about it because of the following issue, right? We built a simulation where we show a multi-layer company where people advance through a typical promotion process. We showed how if it starts gender balanced and you introduce even a slight bias in gender in promotions, you tend to get these very skewed organizations with 80% men at the top and a lot of women at the bottom. And then we asked the following question. Let's say that in 5 years you do a certain amount of damage by introducing some bias. If you then go and remove the bias and then treat everybody fairly, is that sufficient? And it turns out that the damage that you cause in 5 years takes anywhere between 25 and 50 years to undo. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Why? Suppose that you take an intermediate level where you now have 70% men and 30% women, and you're going to promote fairly. If you promote 10 people and you promote fairly, you're going to promote 7 men and 3 women for every 10 people. And so you're going to just perpetuate the biases that you created before. So I'm a complete believer in the fact that you have to have affirmative action. You have to have measures like Astia, Golden Seeds. There are a number of women that are, or a number of organizations that focus on women, because if you don't, you're just going to keep perpetuating the same situation. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So very interesting presentations. I have 2 questions, one of which is a fairly technical question and the other is an empirical question. So I'll ask the empirical question. When everybody else gets bored and leaves, I'll ask the technical question. So the empirical question is the contrast that you set up between between St. Louis and Boston is it's quite provocative. It's a striking contrast. I'm wondering 2 things about it. So one of them is how much you see a difference in the kinds of firms, that is industry, size, tech intensity, and so on between the 2 sites. Because one of the things that we've learned about entrepreneurship over the past 30 years, or what we've come to realize about entrepreneurship over the past 30 years, is that it's not homogenous, and that what probably many people in this room think of as entrepreneurship, that's sort of the high-tech, venture-backed, high-growth startup company, is just the tiniest sliver of what happens. And so I don't know how much the global statistics capture that. I don't know how much your qualitative work has focused in that kind of high-growth tech sector versus more generally, and how the 2 locales differ. And so that's one question. The second question that I had was whether, from your qualitative work, there's any sense of a narrative here about the impact of the existing firm population on the startup population. And that is, if St. Louis is struggling, if its existing firms are dying, that frees up various kinds of resources and creates various kinds of needs, and perhaps creates various kinds of economic pressures and so on that may show up in changes in the mix and change in the natures of startup companies that's very different from some place like Boston that's booming, where in some sense, nobody in Boston has to go out and, this isn't true, right? There's lots of poverty and inequality in Boston, but people who are qualified to work in high-tech firms, have appropriate training in Boston, really don't need to go out and start a firm. If they start a firm, it's because of some other drive, whether it's for exorbitant wealth or for bringing a technology to fruition or what have you, but they don't need to do it to get employed. Whereas in St. Louis, especially for women, especially for minority entrepreneurs, it may be a very different situation. So I guess those are my two questions: the mix of firms, and then the impact of the kind of overall health of the economy and the existing firms in the 2 regions.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. So those are issues that we are trying to figure out. We're hoping to submit to ASQ, so you're actually foreboding reviewers' comments on sort of the historical aspects of each ecosystem, which we're looking into. And that's actually, it's tough to correlate, right? But what we can do is sort of lay out historically, St. Louis and Boston have very different sort of narratives around the industries, the collapse, and then the rise. And Boston is in some ways similar and different. So Cambridge was a nothing, right? Until a few decades ago, there was really very little there. So that there is a history of growth and difference and change. And I think we have, in our data, we actually do look at different industries. So we didn't sort of narrow it down to a particular industry. The interviews are across all kinds of industries. So we can go in and look and see, which we haven't done yet, to look at whether there's an industry explanation for some of these in addition to the gender and race component. And then in terms of history, you're right. What we found is that it's very difficult to undo something that's been established. And in many ways, St. Louis had a little bit more freedom in sort of saying it's something we can make of our own. We can mold it. And that is, I think, where we're going to try to focus on to explain some of these things, the historical aspects. Although I'll say in St. Louis, many more of their conversations right now are around race because of Ferguson. So that is actually an incredibly important component that we haven't focused on as much as we need to. So the racial component and the racial makeup of St. Louis in explaining some of these things, which are working well for the white population and white women, but not necessarily for other kinds of entrepreneurs. So I think those are valid questions, and I think we need to delve deeper. We have the data, we just we haven't necessarily analyzed all of it yet.
You're going to get to your technical question, or you're going to wait, right?
You're gonna wait?
Could you, so the modeling that you did was absolutely fascinating, and most of it had some of them had two variables. So in the car, you had a couple of different behaviors that would model. As you look at the VC decision making, how many variables have you looked at, or will you look at? So is it gender and then risk, or what are some of those things that you could actually move your rheostat and see how ultimately how the decisions come about?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I want to make sure that I clarify in the traffic model, that's actually very simple. The other model, the one with the economic disparity, actually starts to be significantly more complex. And in many cases, there are many more variables inside the model than there are necessarily in the panel where you want to modify. One of the goals of the project is to identify exactly that. In other words, let's start with the simplest possible model of a hypothetical VC that is a hypothetical social network, and let's try to understand what are the variables that we should capture. And the goal with these is always kind of an Occam's razor. You only add a variable if you feel that you really need it to explain a particular part of the phenomenon. It's a little bit different from the typical statistical approaches that we think less about in terms of variables, and we think more in terms of the structure of the model that needs to be included to capture certain behaviors. But I would say for sure gender is one of them, potentially race, but even those can be lumped into almost like a degree of similarity, right? If you think about two people that have a certain degree of dissimilarity, and that dissimilarity can depend on gender, it can depend on socioeconomic factors, it can depend on language, religion, age. And so in a way, initially, we'll probably start with something, a fairly abstract notion of difference, and then drill down into adding gender, race, and things of that sort. But
Which is why we're trying to, we're sort of trying to collaborate with NEVCA, the New England Venture Capital Organization or Association, to gain access to VC firms, one, to do actually in situ observations where they do these negotiations to draw out qualitatively those things that we should be paying attention to beyond what drives us theoretically. Because I think theoretically, abstractly, we have ideas about what we should pay attention to, but until we see it happen, which is the qualitative part, we can't necessarily go just by that. So that's the qualitative part, is to draw out those dimensions.
Oh, now the technical
Okay,
question.
so now I'm going to
Okay.
ask my boring question, because my boring question is really just a boring version of Brendan's more interesting question. But so it makes a good follow-up, right? Because it's a buzzkill. So one of the things that's striking about agent-based simulation is, as a technique, it's now been around and sort of reasonably recognized for a couple of decades, right? And although you do occasionally see agent-based models in the main journals, you don't see them very much. And because I find them fascinating to read, right? I'm trying to think, maybe we're actually more than a couple of decades, because the segregation simulation, right? Axelrod ran that in about 1974 or so, right? So, and so you would think the journals would be full of this stuff because, it fits well with sort of how we understand society. And I think one of the problems with it is that when you argue as a principle that societies are complex, that there are a lot of interactions, the systems are highly interactive, small changes in initial conditions can produce large changes in outcomes and so on, while on the one hand that justifies doing agent-based modeling, on the other hand what it means is that unless you get the parameters of the agents entirely right, you could just be worlds off, right? It's not linear, so you can't say, oh, well, I missed 10% of the parameters, so I'm 10% off of the actual phenomenon. You could be exactly opposite of the actual phenomenon by missing 2% of the parameters. And when you're talking about complex entities like organizations, and innovation ecosystems and so on, it's, on the one hand, you can get very suggestive results, and if you have strong theory and you're modeling out what the theory implies, it can be a good corrective to simplistic understandings of theory. But the next step from saying, this helps me to understand what the theory implies, to saying, this is how the real world works, yeah, that's a very large step. And I'm wondering how how much you're thinking of this as a heuristic, how much you're thinking of this as something, what's your image of how one would publish this, how one would research it? Because it's very provocative, and I'm curious
Right.
how you're going to think of it.
Yeah, and there is one aspect of what you said that I think is not entirely borne out by practice, which is that the notion that if you get potentially the behaviors of the agents even slightly wrong, you can exponentially blow out. Turns out that that's actually not true. It turns out that in many cases, the structure of the system in which the agents operate is significantly more important than the fine level details of what the agents are doing. And one of the other, so as an example, the little game that I showed you, right? It has nothing to do with the agents being smart or being able to see near or far or being intelligent or dumb. When you get people to behave in a certain way, you get, in some cases, the behavior that collapses, in other cases, the behavior that expands. And that's a very, very robust finding. So both in terms of the simulation, in terms of in the real world. And similarly, I've done a lot of work in marketing, for example. And there's a company that I helped to launch that uses this platform to help companies predict the impact of different initiatives. And the accuracy is astounding. I mean, we're talking working with Toyota 2 years before the launch of an entirely new model. We predicted with a 93% accuracy month by month how many sales they would make 2 years later. So, and again, there too, we found that understanding to a super fine level of detail exactly what goes on inside people's heads is not quite as important as we would think, as much as the sort of the global network effects. Now, why do people not use agent? Why do you not see more, especially in the academic research literature, do you not see more? I would argue that there's actually a growing base of that, but I think that my sense is that in the last 20 years, there has been a shift toward using agent-based simulation more for industry work, for application work. And only now I'm starting to see people that are bringing it back and saying, okay, now that we understand better what are the possibilities and limitations, can we dig in a little bit deeper theoretically? I'm hoping, I'm counting on the fact that our work will be worthy of peer-reviewed publications and that it will be something really exciting. I can cite a lot of examples where we got incredibly highly accurate results with these models, and I'm hoping that in this case that will be a similar situation, but the jury's still out on that one.
Questions for Banu. I just had a question about the women entrepreneurial businesses. If you could talk more about what type of businesses these women owned and operated. There's a gendering effect around the type of businesses that they are running. Also, the challenges they face, and let's say they don't get VC funding, what other mechanisms or other ways that they have been able to sustain their businesses?
So they vary across industries, and in Boston there were about 5 or 6 that were high growth. Some were in tech, some were in marketing, some were in consulting. So it was across industries, and we didn't want to narrow it down. We really did want to look at it. So they range the whole spectrum of industries within each city. So it's representative of the city. In terms of coping mechanisms, so when they didn't get funding, they took out credit card debt, personal credit card debt, friends and family. Bank loans were actually quite small. Many of them didn't want to or didn't know about becoming women or minority owned business status certified, so that would help them with loans. So that wasn't even something that was on their radar. Others tried to just get something like golden seeds, so smaller amounts of seed funding. So there were all these different coping mechanisms, and it wasn't necessarily related to industry. For example, in biotech, it's like 10 years before they actually have a viable product or service. So there are these different sort of time periods in which they might actually see a positive revenue stream. So for those, their best hope was to get bought out by a huge pharmaceutical. So there were different ways in which they aspired to grow, and depending on where they were, their stage, and sometimes industry, their source for investment was quite different.
Any more? Oh.
I have a non-technical question. So, we're in working with a lot of young entrepreneurs. One of the things that we often talk about is that scarce resources can be a benefit, that by having a certain constraint that can actually spur all kinds of creativity. Obviously, want to be careful not to overstate the case, because all of a sudden you don't want to be in the position of perpetuating resource imbalances with all sorts of deleterious effects. I'm just wondering, in looking at VCs and capital funding, if the kind of the benefits of scarce resources narrative has crept into this at all in the kind of the qualitative work in particular that you've done thus far.
So it comes through in sort of, we fund the best. And the notion that their methods of funneling, due diligence, and picking, because there are scarce resources, the assumption that they are picking the best. But there's no sort of assessment of those 10 firms that you funded, which ones really had a return compared to the 10 that you didn't fund. So that scarce resource narrative comes in when it helps them justify their decisions, not necessarily because it's the truth per se. It's not to say there's abundance of money out there, but still the existing money is framed in such a way that you're lucky to get in front of a VC. So that's step one. And then anything beyond that is sort of kind of a black box, actually, in many ways. And that's what we're trying to uncover. What does that look like? Because in many ways, the VCs will tell you they have these very objective criteria for who they fund and how they fund them. I think our sense is that we don't think that those are so objective.
And if I can break down the qualitative barrier and answer the qualitative question, I want to add something to it, which is that there is a part of the discourse that I've heard that relates to that, I think, at least indirectly. One of them is that there's a lot of evidence that women tend to be much more capital efficient in their companies. So you find that companies that are run by women tend to use less money and tend to perform better, even at the early stages. And then another interesting phenomenon, there was a study published recently by American Express Small Business Association, I believe, in which they tracked the creation of new firms, and they found that since the recession of 2008, that actually the fastest growing segments of the population in terms of creating new businesses were African American women and Latino women, and they actually are creating more businesses than anybody else. And so both of those kind of speak, perhaps indirectly, to the how the scarcity of resources can actually drive certain behaviors in a way that manifests itself perhaps indirectly like that. But as you pointed out, it's something that you wouldn't want necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily encourage that to be the case. But
Right, of course.
Yeah. All right. Where's dessert? Any other questions? I guess we can also stick around if anybody has any more things they want to talk about afterward. But otherwise,
Thank you.
all right. Thank you.